Please join me in the responsive reading in your order of service. I call that church free, which enters into covenant with the ultimate source of existence. That sustaining and transforming power not made with human hands. It binds together families and generations, protecting against the idolatry of any human claim to absolute truth or authority. This covenant is the charter and responsibility and joy of worship in the face of death as well as life. I call that church free, which brings individuals into a caring, trusting fellowship. That protects and nurtures liberty and spiritual freedom that yearns to belong to the church universal. It is open to insight and conscience from every source. It bursts through rigid tradition, giving rise to new and living language, to new and broader fellowship. It is a pilgrim church, servant church, on an adventure of the Spirit. The goal is the prophethood and priesthood of all believers. The one for the liberty of prophesying, the other for the ministry of healing. It aims to find unity in diversity under the promptings of the Spirit that bloweth where it listeth and maketh all things new.
So this is Fountain Street Church, which from time to time we are told in various corners of our blessed neighborhood is not a real church. And I submit that it is the most real church that exists. Because the word church does not mean a place where the people who are better than others get together. It's the place where people who have chosen to gather. The very word church comes ultimately from a Greek word eklektos, which means elect. And of course, some Christians would say, well, we're the elect. But I want to go to that other notion of elect as in to choose. Every one of you here today has chosen to be here, and the act of choosing is what creates the church each and every week. It does not exist in the abstract. It only exists in the moment when people choose to show up. Isn't that what Woody Allen said? 80% of life is showing up. Well, 100% of church is showing up. Not just on Sunday, but to your spouse, to your parents, to your children, to your neighbor, to your work, to your world. At Fountain Street Church, we preach a message of liberation, animation, and agitation. To liberate the mind so that you can make choices that you choose, not someone else chose for you or inveigled you in without knowing, like Tom Sawyer's whitewashed fence. To animate does not mean simply to rouse your passions, but to be alive in your own soul, so that you can feel the promptings of the Spirit that bloweth where they listeth and maketh all free. And to agitate means to be alive and awake in a way that disturbs the status quo. Not meanly, not harshly, not with a scolding finger or a bad attitude, but something that says, I dare to be alive in a world that wants us to be asleep. I dare to choose when the world wants us to only go along. I dare to be a person in a world full of drones. To be at Fountain Street Church is to be a liberated, animated, agitated soul. And if you're here for the first time, welcome home. We are a company of chosen ones, not chosen by God, but we have chosen each other for the work of the Spirit. Welcome to Fountain Street Church.
My thoughts today turn to the trends in church attendance in developed nations as a starting point. And from there, I want to speculate a bit on what that might imply for our congregation. And I'll start with an anecdote from 1969. It was in Europe. I was in Munich studying at the Goethe Institute. Between my junior and senior years in college, about to embark on a career as a medieval historian, for which I needed a little better German than I had at the time. And part of the summer's travels included a trip to England, where I met up with my mother, and we went to the Midlands searching for the roots of the Wykes family, which is her maiden name. And we went through Buckinghamshire and Worcestershire. We went looking to places that we knew were origins of the Wykes family, and we went to little parish churches to see what we could find by looking in registers. Well, it was a fascinating way to find your way around the countryside. And we saw some absolutely beautiful little churches, hundreds of years old, full of character, probably full of stories that people could have told had they been there. But what we found when we went to those invariably was that they were empty. And in addition to that, we found inevitably a little wooden box in the foyer of the church with a slot in the top and a sign on it that read, because of our dwindling church attendance, we depend on the kindness of strangers to maintain this building. That this building stays in decent repair only when tourists like you put in a shilling or two, which of course my mother dutifully did every stop. But I thought, how odd, isn't it, that the protector of the poor for centuries is now itself somewhat of an indigent begging for the kindness of strangers for its own continued existence. Well, this was 1969, and as you can guess, the trend from there has been gradually down. So what is church attendance in other developed nations? Generally, that takes us to Europe, and that takes us to England and to France. And a survey done in 2004 found actually, and this is surprising to me, identical levels of church attendance in England and France. England, home of the Anglican Church, France, the staunch Catholic nation, both having church attendance of about 12%. 12%. That is to say, 88% didn't attend church regularly. Go farther north, and you find an even more really amazing trend. All over Scandinavia, the average church attendance rates at that point in time were between 3 and 5%. 3 and 5%. So there weren't a lot of people dropping coins in slots other than tourists to maintain all those incredibly beautiful pieces of history all over Europe. Well, let's go a little closer to home. Let's go to our neighbor to the north of us, who we think of as being an awful lot like us, which they probably resent, but we go ahead and think that anyway. At that point in time, regular church attendance in Canada was right around 20%, so substantially higher than this part of Europe that I've described, the most advanced and progressive part in my view. And how about the U.S.? Again, at that point in time, the reported average or regular attendance in church was 39%. Now that's a pretty solid number compared with some of the European numbers, but keep in mind that means that 61% do not regularly attend church, do not have a regular church affiliation. That's really quite a large number, and certainly quite a change from what we grew up with in the 50s, most of us. Can't speak for all of you. And here's a little caveat. There's a great propensity to over-report one's church attendance, okay? Typically, how these surveys are conducted is people just go out and say, do you regularly attend church? Sometimes, most times, once in a while, always, never, you know how those things work. Somebody got the bright idea, not too many years ago, of comparing reported church attendance with actual church attendance. And they went to a small population, rural county in Ohio, which you could count on as being a pretty churchy bunch, but also was small enough that they were able to do an exhaustive count and an exhaustive survey. And so they asked people, do you regularly attend church? And 36% said, yes, I attend church regularly. Then they went to the services and counted butts and seats. And what they found was that the regular attendance rate at church was about 20%. So when you read those statistics, keep that in mind. It's really kind of the opposite of what happens when the doctor asks you how many alcoholic drinks a week you consume. So we have a tendency to over-report or under-report, depending on the context. Be that as it may, the church attendance in the U.S., arguably among the most developed nations in the world, is substantially higher than it is in other developed nations. Why should that be? Maybe it's not 39%, but maybe it's 25%. That's still way beyond what you experience in Northwestern Europe. And for this question, I turn to a fascinating book by the New York Times drama critic, Professor Harold Bloom from Yale University. Well, right away you say, wait a minute, Charlie, what are you going to a drama critic for information about church affiliation and church ideology? Well, I do that for several reasons. recognizing full well that I'm sure there are flaws in this work, that this is not his area of expertise. Yet he's a very, very sharp and very well-educated and very observant person. One reason is that it really comes often from people straying outside their very narrow specialization, where they find some real startling and new connections or relationships. And so I think it's healthy for people to look outside their normal bailiwick. And I think it's very helpful that Professor Bloom did that. Plus, I have to say, as a former student of medieval history, there's a tremendous amount of historical work done by people with such obvious biases that it's difficult sometimes to wade through it. And so here's a man who was raised in a Jewish community and considers himself to be more or less secular, trying to describe what it is in American religion that makes it so vital compared with other developed nations in the world. I think that's a good perspective to look at. And what happens, what turns out, is that the only real growth in American church-going is in the indigenous varieties. Okay? The traditional mainline Protestants and Catholics have declining attendance, all of them. The only sects that are growing, that are vital, that are somehow reaching out and attracting new minds and new butts in seats are the homegrown ones. And there are several. But probably the most obvious example is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, as we commonly refer to them. When this Professor Bloom's book was written in 1992, it represented about 2% of the population in the United States. That is to say, it was a group basically the same size as Judaism. But here's the amazing thing. It had, up until then, and continues to have an annual growth rate of about 6%. Well, that sounds healthy. That sounds reasonable. We all would like our stock portfolios to grow at 6 or maybe even 7%. But let's look at it another way. And this is a very simple extrapolation from compound interest. If your portfolio is growing at 6%, that means it doubles every 12 years. If it grows at 8%, it doubles every 10 years. So too with a population of a group. If the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints continues to grow at 6% indefinitely, which is not terribly likely, but certainly that growth is currently being realized and can be expected for some time, that means it doubles every 12 years. That's really robust growth that other churches envy. What are some of the other homegrown religions that are also very vital and growing? The very largest group is generally referred to as Pentecostals. The best known group among them is the Assembly of God. There's also the Seventh-day Adventists, which is growing by leaps and bounds, particularly in the Caribbean and in Central America, but also doing quite well here in the States. Jehovah's Witnesses, another indigenous faith, and probably the biggest group of all, the Southern Baptists, which I think Professor Bloom rightly regards as the dominant religious denomination of the American Southeast. Well, what do all these have in common? At first, it seems like they're a very disparate group, and they certainly have very different practices, and they appeal to different people for different reasons. But here's where the insight of somebody who understands and studies literature and has read a great deal of religious information as well points to an interesting parallel among all of them. And that is, very simply put, despite all their protestations to the contrary, they're basically not Christian. basically not Christian. Now, this is not, mind you, some Catholic or some Presbyterian saying, these guys aren't good enough to be one of us. Okay? This is a secular Jew saying, these faiths are fundamentally not in compliance with what is traditionally regarded as Christian dogma. And instead, he sees a very strong tie with Gnosticism. What's that? That's an ancient Christian heresy going back almost as far as time itself, based on the idea of gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge. And for salvation under Gnosticism, the essential characteristic, the essential need is for special knowledge, which is very much a characteristic of all of these homegrown U.S. faiths. In addition, Gnosticism carries with it a very dualistic view of the cosmos. The cosmos is divided into good and evil. It's not all part of God's plan. In fact, only half of it is really the God that we think of as the good guy. The other half belongs to the bad guy. And so there's this constant conflict between good and evil, or between spirit and matter. Spirit identifies with good, matter identifies with evil. And so humans, in the Gnostic notion of things, are very much a unstable combination of good and evil, of spirit and matter, of a good spirit trapped in an evil body. This is very contrary to traditional Christian teaching. The other aspect of Gnosticism that Professor Bloom sees very clearly in all of these homegrown religions is the emphasis on personal experience. You have to have a direct relationship with God. There are no intermediaries. You need to have your own sense of the divine, and it doesn't take learning, it doesn't take knowledge, conventional knowledge, it takes special knowledge, the knowledge you can get from the sect. But that sect does not stand between you and the divine. And this he sees as appealing particularly to the American sense of self-reliance. Basically, the religious seeker is alone in the universe. And here's the ultimate difference with traditional Christian dogma. The ultimate goal of the Gnostic is not to have one's soul saved. The ultimate goal of the Gnostic is to become God. Very, very contrary to Christian teaching. Well, here we are in the U.S. with a lot of declining old-line Christian faiths and some growing, not so terribly Christian faiths in spite of their protestations to the contrary. Which way will we go? Will we follow Europe's lead, or will we continue to go off on our own and have these non-Christian faiths continue to flourish? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I would put my bet on the probability of the traditional Christian faiths continuing to decline. And I do that because I see our culture as being still heavily dependent on the leadership of Europe. This is in spite of everything you see about Hollywood telling the rest of the world what pop culture is. When it comes to real culture, I see Europe as still a strong influence. Think for a moment about the beer that your parents drank and the beer that your kids drink, or the wine that your parents didn't drink, because that was for Frenchies, and the wine that your kids love to drink. A lot's changed in those simple matters in 40 years. Same with food, for that matter. You know, we aren't just burgers and fries anymore. Now, these may seem a little superficial to you, but I submit that what one eats and drinks is pretty vital to one's own sense of self and outlook on the world. And to that, I say we are still following the European example. If these aren't sufficient for you, I'll put in something a little more substantial. What about same-sex marriage? I think it's very appropriate that that comes up in this context because we finally have followed the European lead in that regard. How about socialized medicine? People worry about creeping socialism in our medical system. You probably, many of you would agree with me that it's creeping altogether too slowly. But creep it is. And I think that the day is not too far in the future when it will expand more, and we will collectively come together as a society and say, yes, we want to watch out for the welfare of everyone among us. I see also a trend towards the abolition of capital punishment. That didn't start here. That started elsewhere in the world. So I would put my money on the continued following of the European lead in all these areas, including church attendance. Now I turn our attention now briefly to the history of the Christian church. And I'd like to just bring up a few examples out of the past that I think help illustrate what these trends might mean for us and what our position in our own religious development might be. Obviously, there's lots of material here to draw from, so I'll have to be very brief. But let's just take the basic growth of the Christian church over the centuries. There's a very comforting notion that we have this continuity with the past that takes us all the way back to Jesus of Nazareth. And it's been protected for centuries, for 2 millennia, by first the Catholic Church and then the Protestants who, in their view, were getting back to the true teachings of Christ. And so we all, those of us in the Christian tradition, feel like we have this connection to the past through the church, and that there is this unchanging and enduring direct connection that's been preserved over the ages. Well, that's a very comforting view, but my own reading of history is that it really is mostly a myth. And that reality has been, of course, very, very different. What we have in history is a continual dialectic of human failure and church reform. That there have been over the centuries, untold numbers of deviations from the practices of the past and valiant attempts to somehow bring them back, each of which really ends up changing the way we worship and the way we think about the divine. That's why I use the term dialectic. If you're familiar with Hegel, there's the thesis and the antithesis. They come together and a new and different thesis emerges. And in fact, that I think is a better reading of church history. I'll give you just one example. Monasticism began in the 3rd century in the deserts of Egypt. And it was basically a movement of hermits. People would go out and live on their own in the desert and trying to emulate Jesus. It was founded by St. Anthony in the 3rd century. Monasticism developed a great deal from that, including the onset of the Benedictine group and the rules that they brought to their adherents. And as a result of their success, they were drowned in bequests of land. Huge tracts of land were given to the Benedictines all through the early Middle Ages. And the orders became incredibly rich and very, very self-centered and quite willing to ignore the needs of a lot of the people around them. And so there was this constant need to reform and revitalize and get back to the principles of monasticism that were the emulation of Christ in the wilderness. One example of that is the Cluniacs. Cluny is a town in central France. In the early 10th century, Duke William of Aquitaine, which is roughly western France, but included Cluny, established a monastery at Cluny that very much restored the integrity of monastic life. But this also led to huge donations to the movement. People were so enthusiastic about what wonderful things they did that they soon were spreading all over France and gobbling up huge tracts of land and becoming very wealthy. So that by the early 12th century, it had to be done all over again by Bernard of Clairvaux, who founded the Cistercian group of monasteries in Citeaux, which is near Dijon in the Burgundy region. But it was essentially the same need and the same process and the same reform, and that wasn't the last time it was done. Those are just examples. That from the regular clergy, regular meaning the clergy that follows a regula or a rule. Regula is Latin for rule. It also is true of the secular clergy, or the clergy that pays attention to the needs of the laity. A simple example of that is the investiture controversy of the 11th century, in which the practice of simony was challenged. Simony is the buying and selling of church offices. And at that point in time, most church offices were awarded by lay nobility, by dukes, by counts, by earls. They owned the land after all, or were in charge of it, and so they would decide who could be the next priest, the next bishop, the next abbot, whatever. And they often did that in return for some dinero, a la Governor Bogdanovich. It's hard to imagine. But this was the normal course of things in the 11th century, was church offices were bought and sold. And they were bought and sold based on their potential income. They were no fools. They knew what it was worth to get all the alms that would come in from this particular assignment. A few centuries later, only the most obvious example of reform is the Reformation, hence the name. But it was another example of a desire to return to the principles of the early church because of the deviation, primarily by the Pope in Rome and his willingness to suck most of Europe dry of its money in order to build monuments to classical culture and himself, incidentally. There are many others. Most of you can probably remember Vatican II. This isn't quite as egregious an example, but it is an example of where the church found that it was no longer serving the needs of those who came to worship, and it needed to change. And that continues to this day. If you've been following the trip of Pope Francis in Latin America, he's been burning up the countryside with excoriating attacks on global capitalism, which he calls the dung of the devil. And he makes a very clear case for capitalism's failure to create fairness, equity, and dignified livelihoods for the world's poor. But here's the kicker. In and amongst all these protestations, the line that gets the biggest response in Latin America is his formal apology for the church's complicity in the colonial era. Forgive me, Father, for we have sinned. The church was very much a part of that. The church was part of the power structure, and as a result, there was a lot of suffering. That needs to be acknowledged. That reform has been pretty well made, but you can imagine there's still vestiges of it. So these are just examples from church history. The basic kernel here is that everyone needs reform. Every group needs reform. No group can just sort of self-perpetuate and expect to survive. People fall away, they lapse from the true path. And so it's a sort of almost a sine curve. There's always a falling away and a need to return. And that's just a basic fact of life. It's natural for organizations. Change really is the only constant. And as you study history, you get used to the idea that history seems to operate more on a pendulum than on a steady rise. We try one thing, we're all excited about it, We think it's going to solve the ills of the world, and then we find to our dismay that it doesn't. And so we go the other direction and try the opposite thing. So, for example, the reforms under FDR were very much a response to the failures of capitalism during the Great Depression. And it works both ways. It's not just liberal against conservative, it's conservative against liberal. The Reagan Revolution was very much a reaction to the excesses of the Great Society. When LBJ created all these agencies with high-minded goals, it created a lot of opportunities for graft, corruption, and inefficiency. And that really gave rise to the spirit of the Reagan Revolution. Well, what does all this mean for us? First, where do we fit in this continuum of American religious experience? Are we mainstream Protestant? Some of us use that term. We certainly compare ourselves with other mainstream Protestant groups, and there's a certain validity to that, but I would suggest that we are a little more than that, really the radical fringe of the American religion, which is the name of Dr. Bloom's book. That Gnostic homegrown faith that emphasizes knowledge and personal experience. Why do I say that? Well, because for one reason, we're very true to our Baptist heritage. And it's no coincidence that Baptist churches everywhere have never espoused a formal creed, nor did we. And so we're very proud of the fact that we are creed-free. This, of course, makes it difficult to analyze who we are. And when I do this, I certainly hope I don't offend anybody, because not everyone's going to agree with everything I say. But what I will offer to you is that we do value knowledge a great deal. Now, it's a different kind of knowledge. It's not secret knowledge that we get from guys in white robes who are 80 years old and have been keeping secrets from everybody else for years. But it's still knowledge that we find to be spiritually enlightening. And it's knowledge that's difficult to obtain because it takes a lot of work. I think most of us probably reject the basic notion of original sin. While we don't think we're all perfect, we don't think we're all corrupt. I think most of us accept the existence of evil in the world and don't fight the battle of trying to figure out why God put evil there and hope that there's some grand plan that's really just testing us so that ultimately we can escape it. No, it's here, it's now, it's with us, and the best we can do is try and minimize its effects on others. So I regard us as being traditionally Christian only in a very limited sense. And we are based loosely on Christian tradition. And I'll recount a little anecdote that kind of sums it up. I had a friend who grew up in a very strict Jewish family and married a very strict Catholic. And they were working out their spiritual life together, and it was quite a challenge. So I said to him, well, you should try Fountain Street. We're just a synagogue with Christmas. Which he laughed off. He thought that was funny. And I kind of meant it as a joke. And this was 15 years ago, the more I think about it, there's a kernel of truth there. We do appreciate our Judeo-Christian heritage, and we're very happy to take from there and outside of it as well. Needless to say, he didn't join. But here is a big difference between us and the other U.S. originals that I've described and it's just a handful. Those are only the most influential ones. There are dozens of others like Christian Scientists and on and on and on. Here's the big difference. We aren't growing. We haven't started a movement. There aren't Fountain Street churches popping up all over the country. We aren't out there on the street corner proselytizing, thank heaven. But it does mean that we have a rather tenuous existence. And we have had our own ebbs and flows of strength and vitality and weakness and looking at death's door ourselves. Take, for example, Wishart's church, which was very strong and vital. It was pretty well gone by the 40s. Okay? This would have been a pretty big group to attend church, even in season in the 40s. And so by the time Duncan Littlefair got here, what he had was a sense of tradition, some money from the old guard who was still willing to invest in the church, and this magnificent building. And that's pretty much what he started with. Now, he had a couple other things going for him, too, that no longer exist. One is there were all kinds of people exiting traditional faiths looking for some place to go. And we were it. Today, there's a lot more competition. Okay, if there had been a sign in someone's yard saying peace or war is not the answer in the 50s, you know who that would have been. Okay, but now it's, I think, Plymouth Avenue CRC, if I'm not mistaken. And there's lots of others in all denominations. There's fairly liberal choices out there. In addition to that, nobody has to go to church the way they used to. Okay, it's perfectly respectable to be unchurched today. It was not then. As bad a mark as it was to attend Fountain Street Church, it was worse not to go to church. Okay, so it was kind of the devil in the deep blue sea, and most of them chose this devil. Today, that's not the case. Most of the people who would resonate with our message have already exited church and aren't really looking to return. Where are we today? Well, I think we're in transition today. I think we don't have the momentum of growth. We don't have the momentum of a sense of vision and purpose that we once had. And I submit to you that the formula from the 50s is no longer enough, that we need a new formula. That we can't return to what we think of as our roots, because that was really something that happened then, at that time, in that place. It's not really relevant today. When we called our last 2 or 3 church leaders, most of us were of the opinion that what we needed was a really great preacher, that would somehow take care of it, because Duncan was a really great preacher and we had lots of members. Well, I'm here to tell you that we have really great sermons, today being the exception. I find the sermons absolutely stimulating, invigorating, well-crafted, and not just Fred's, although primarily Fred's. We have sermons far better than a lot of preaching that you will hear elsewhere. Next time you're out of town on a Sunday, go to the UU church. You'll feel at home there, you'll like it, and you'll come away disappointed with the message, I wager. In fact, here I will confidently predict that sometime in the future, a lot of us will sit around and pine for the good old Fred Wooden days, when we got real substance served up with very craftily put together notions. Now, I was originally going to have Jason sitting there, so sorry, Fred. Don't mean to embarrass you. So what is it? If it's not sermons that sustain us, what is it? I'm over time. Most of our efforts in the past decade or so have gone toward the social gospel. And I think this is a wonderful trend. I'm glad that we give our offering out to the community. I'm glad that our social action committee is now actually a force in the community for philanthropic giving. But I think that's not sufficient. And I say that because there's any number of not-for-profit associations that do similar work. And for a lot of people, being a member of the Rotary Club or the Lions Club or the Kiwanis or Zonta, there's dozens of them, will push that same button. I'm helping, I'm giving, I'm participating, I'm part of the community. I don't need to go to church on Sunday in order to do that. So that's not enough, in my opinion. So where does that leave us? I speak now as a member of the old guard, which I'm just sort of coming to grips with. I think church as we know it is over. Put it bluntly. Not that it's going to go away tomorrow, not that it's going to go away next week, but I don't think it will continue the way we've been used to it. And this pains me a bit because I still think Bach and Mozart are the greatest, and I probably always will. I like a little pomp and circumstance. I like our sense of ritual. I grew up with it. I'm used to it. But you know what? That's not now. That's years ago. And so even though that's what I like and I'm comfortable with, I look forward to the day when we get rid of some of these things. Here's a simple example. Does the choir need to wear robes every Sunday? I respectfully disagree, Mr. Schweitzer. Now, it does mask our physical difficulties. It does help us look all alike. I think it sets the choir apart as something other than the congregation. And I would welcome a few services now and again where we as choir members are part of the congregation more, and that's one way to do it. So without something new, without something sustaining, I think we can expect our attendance to drop. We could find a charismatic leader that would bring more people in. I submit that that's probably going to be temporary, that would be evidence of our continuing clergy dependence, as Speed Lee's put it, and that we need more than just inspiring leadership for us to find our way in the future. We need a cohesive mission that comes out of us. We have to own the church more than we do. So what do? Well, we engage in long-term discussion. Why are we here? Why aren't more people joining us? What is it that we really have to offer to people? I wish I could tell you the answers to these questions. I don't know them, but I think it's important that we all ask them together of one another. It's not enough anymore to be a place for recovering Catholics or Presbyterians or people from the Jewish faith. Okay? That's not the formula we need. We need to figure out what we are as a people of faith, and I believe that we are. I think it takes faith to get out of bed in the morning. I think we have a very strong faith. It's just really hard to pin it down in the absence of any dogma. And in fact, it makes me wonder if we don't need a new mythology. Most people like to have a story. Most people like to have a personal relationship with something or someone that helps them see their way into their spiritual lives. So what is the story that will take the place of Christ crucified for those of us who no longer resonate with it, which is probably the majority of us? Well, these are big questions. These are difficult questions. And it'd be nice if we could just sit down, have the vision, and say, okay, from this vision we go to step A and step B and so forth. The way corporate planning is done, the way strategic planning in America's great corporations goes on. You start with a big picture and you see where that takes you. That's a nice model. Reality isn't always that simple, doesn't always work that way. So I suggest that maybe we turn it upside down and start with some of the little things, and maybe that will help us find our vision. For example, we're sitting here in the midst of an incredible piece of real estate, which lies empty almost the whole week. And in fact, substantial portions of it are empty all week long, aren't used even on Sunday mornings. What would this place do that would advance our vision of who we are and what we want for the world? What could those things be? Now, there's some obvious ones, and I caution you not to just discard them because, oh, yeah, sure we could do that, but everybody else does that, and we've thought of that, and we didn't do it for whatever reason. Such things as a soup kitchen, such things as a hostel, such things as a daycare center. These are all crying needs. There's never quite enough of the supply to meet the demand. These are things that we could do if collectively we chose them to be part of our vision. Let's go a little farther afield. Here's another example. What if we were to start a youth arts center? You know, a lot of kids go to the Y after school and shoot baskets, and that's a good place for them, and they love it, and it gives them exercise and fellowship and all sorts of good things. But not every kid fits in at the Y. There are a lot of kids who have a much more artistic bent. What if we had practice rooms for them with old pianos in them? What if we had an art lab for them so they could draw or sculpt? What if we had a film lab so that they could make movies? Have registered kids after school come in, supervised, all that sort of thing. It's a lot of work. It'll take a lot of effort. It'll take some money. But is this something that we see as a good use of this space and a good extension of our vision? Perhaps. Let's talk about it. Here's an even wilder idea. What if we were to start a nonprofit agency incubator? Nonprofits have their own life cycle, just like churches, just like political movements, just like governments. They are born, they grow, they stagnate, they die. And they have to be replaced by new nonprofits. And it's usually the new ones that have the real pulse of what's needed, either in the community or all the way around the world. Wouldn't it be great if there were a place where somebody with an idea could go and get some basic helping hands for establishing a nonprofit? You have only to look as far as our own answer to see what a relatively new nonprofit can do to better the world. It's fabulous what Earl has achieved. But that had to start nowhere, and it started because of his incredible dedication. Well, what if there was a little bit of help located in the basement of Fountain Street Church for people with those visions? If we succeeded in incubating just one in the next 20 years, wouldn't that be a great gift to the world? Well, let me finish up quickly here. We still have our worship services. We still need our worship services. I like the idea that there is an early service in here at 9:30 or 9:45. I haven't been able to attend because I'm in the choir and we're practicing. It's probably not my cup of tea. I am part of the old guard. But it's vital, it's growing, it's serving needs, and I think that that's laudable, and we should do more of that. We can also continue to do some of our traditional worship. Certainly we don't want to throw it all out. But let me just caution you that when you use the same liturgy, the same order of service, the same music, the same hymns over and over and over again, you are ignoring the enormous untapped wealth of potential inspiration. Here's a simple example. It's time for Blessed Izzy to take a rest. Okay? Blessed Izzy, for those of you not in the choir, is Sing O Heavens. And I have a reputation in the choir as being the despiser of that piece. I don't despise it. It's neither the best nor the worst piece that we've ever done. The best, of course, is still Bach and Mozart. The worst is reserved for John Rutter. But Blessed Izzy has been sung every year for, I think, 51. And Mary Lou can tell you exactly how many, because she's probably done almost all of them. And it's time to try something different, because the comfort offered by tradition and repetition is itself a little bit of an act of hypnosis, self-hypnosis, in my opinion. Okay? I'm not saying don't ever do Blessed Izzy again, but give it a rest. Try something new. We need to try new things. And you say, well, Charlie, change for its own sake isn't always good. And my retort is adherence to old ways is almost always a bad idea. it stagnates the Spirit. We do occasionally need to seek comfort, and we come here for that. We also need to seek inspiration. And we find comfort in doing things the way we've always done them. That's not the source of inspiration in most cases. What I'm describing is an organic process. It can't be leader-led. It requires intense self-appraisal on our part, and it requires an ongoing dialogue. A lot of us heaved a big sigh of relief when Speed Lees was done with his work, and it was very good work, and it accomplished its goal, but the work isn't done. The work isn't done. That was just the beginning. We need to continue that work, and in fact, maybe we even have an ongoing need for a committee of 60/90 or some such thing, because our future path is not something that is very clear to me, and I think to many of you. So let me close with a very traditional reading, very short, which may seem a little ironic to you, and the irony isn't lost on me either. But if you just substitute a few words or ideas here and there, I think you'll agree that this quotation from St. Paul is entirely relevant to what I've been describing to you. This is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things.